She moves into it, and there it goes. It's high enough, it's long enough, it's a beauty. It's straight between the posts. The score hit out.
Hello and welcome to That's the Way It Was, a program that looks back at the history of rugby league. In episode 16, in 1978, Western Suburbs appoint a former school teacher to coach its first grade team. What follows is a period of great success for the Magpies. But not everyone is happy with the new coach's teaching methods. And what follows for the game of rugby league is a massive change in how it is governed. To make these changes, Rugby League's version of Wyatt Earp rides into town. To discuss this period of Rugby League's history, we're going to speak to Paul Oliver, a lifelong supporter of the Western Suburbs Magpies and the director of a documentary called The Fibros and the Silvertails. The Fibros and the Silvertails. So, Paul, welcome to That's the Way It Was.
G'day, mate. How are you?
Not too bad. Paul, before we speak about what happened in 1978, I just wanted to have a look back at what was going on at Western Suburbs before 1978. Now, in the 1977 season, West finished 9th in the old New South Wales Rugby League. They had just 7 wins in 1977. And in the off-season, well, they sign a few players. Bruce Gibbs comes over from Newtown. There's a winger from Cronulla called David Waite, and they get a couple of players from South Sydney, Buddy Kane and Trevor Reardon from South. So there's no real major signings in the off-season for Western Suburbs, but there is a major change in the coaching situation because Roy Masters, who's been coaching at West, he's been coaching West's under-23 team, and West do win the under-23 premiership in 1977. Well, he takes over as first-grade coach from Keith Holman, who was the coach for during the 1977 season. So, Paul, I know you were only very young at that point of time, but what were your expectations going into the 1978 season, and did you know anything about this school teacher, Roy Masters?
Well, not very much, considering how much we know about him these days, and what a personality he is in rugby league. Not a lot. And as you say, it was another disappointing season for West. I think growing up, and I was only, 9 in 1977. Mm-hmm. Growing up, you're used to a series of defeats. Our last premiership is back in the early 1950s. We were runners-up to St George 3 times in a row, I think. So, growing up in a Magpies family, you had a sense that we'd been the bridesmaid but never the bride for quite a few years. So expectations were not high. However, there were some encouraging signs in 1977. We did finish 9th in the premiership, but we won the AMCO Cup, which was the Wednesday night competition. And there was a bit of controversy that we were undefeated, I think, in the AMCO Cup and won our games quite convincingly, beating East in the grand final of the AMCO Cup. But in the premiership games either side of that final, we got completely flogged by 30 or 40 points. So it was clear that we were putting our efforts into that competition. And the other positive sign, as you said, was that Roy had been coaching the under-23s 76 and 77. And in 1977, they won the premiership. So, there were little signs that, there was some new blood coming into the club, a new coach, a young coach. Keith Holman had only been there for a year and he had coached, I think, almost 20 years earlier. So it was, you're always hopeful, particularly as a child going into a new season. But there was some, there were some growths of hope, I suppose.
All right, yes. Well, just reading the papers there, West were 200-1 on to win the premiership at the start of the 78 season. So, the 78 season starts, and it starts with the preseason competition. They had preseason competitions back then, and at this time it's known as the Craven Mild Cup. South Sydney actually win the Craven Mile Cup in 1978. They beat Canterbury in the final, but there's going to be a playoff for third place between West and Manly. And this playoff is going to take place in Melbourne. The Fitzroy AFL club has organised they're calling it a festival of football at the Junction Oval there in St Kilda. There's going to be a soccer match. There's an AFL match. And then there's this playoff for third between West and Manly. So, Paul, what happens in Melbourne? Because this is basically where your documentary begins.
Yeah, and Roy has come in as coach on the changeover between 77 and 78, and he's brought up a couple of players, younger players, and some new signings for that last year, and the team that we know in a sense as the 78 Magpies team. Boyd and Rodonicus being our players like that. They're all on board, and there's Mick Labinskas, who's been around for a few years. They all go down. They fly down to Melbourne, and being the Rugby League, they put both teams on the same plane.
Yes.
They don't go to the main airport. For some reason, they end up at Essendon Airport. They get put on the same bus. And it's really, from what a few people told me, Tommy, Les Boyd and Roy, that the trouble started on the bus. Roy and Les Boyd got on the bus before the other players, and they're all Manly players on the bus. And one of the Manly players made some disparaging comments about the scruffiness, I think, of the West players who were still standing outside. Now, Tommy Rodonicus' recollection is that he actually said, "Look at that! Look at those sacks of shit standing out there," and but there was a little bit of a tendency to exaggerate that with hindsight, I think. But the story goes that Les got pretty upset. Roy had to pull him back, and that was the beginning of the bad blood. But there's another story there as well, which Stephen Knight from Manly told, that he got on the plane or the bus and sat next to a West player that he had played in reserves with years ago. And that player said to him, Knighty, sorry, mate, I can't speak with you. We've been told not to talk to you by the coach. So there's two sides to this, that, maybe Roy was already thinking of the Fibros and Silvertails mentality, the us and them, and had told the players to, don't be too friendly with these Manly blokes, even though it's a friendly game. Let's go in there with a bit of attitude. So you can choose to believe what happened. Either way, whichever side is, whichever story is correct, and maybe it's a combination of both. By the time they get down to Junction Oval, down in St Kilda in Melbourne, the West players are sort of hyped up a bit, and that gets amped up even more. The first half of the game, Manly sort of have the best of them, and at halftime they go in, and as was told by Kevin Humphreys, who was the head of the Rugby League at that point, sitting up in the grandstand above the dressing rooms, he could hear Roy going off and using all sorts of language to rev the players up, so that by the time they then come out for the second half, West come out and, they go full throttle. They're out for blood. And it's, from all accounts, it was a pretty brutal game.
Yes, okay. Well, the reports you read, they will basically say that basically the second half, there were just brawls continued throughout the second half. A couple of Manly players ended up in hospital. But, yes, it seems that this is where Roy Masters... and Roy, I think we should point out, had a master's in or a degree in psychology from his days at Sydney University. But this is possibly when he starts this us versus them, or the Fibros versus the Silvertails ideology. Okay, so the competition proper begins, and West are going along okay. But we come to a round 7 fixture against Manly. And I should point out that at the start of the season, okay, Manly are rated as one of the favourites. They're one of the favourites to win this competition. But May the 7th, round 7, May the 7th at Lidcombe Oval, they're playing against Manly. Paul, do you remember what happens in this match?
Yeah, again, I mean, a few weeks or months have passed since the game, the pre-season game down in Melbourne.
Yes.
It's back on again. And as you said, Manly were the favourites. They'd won the premiership, I think, at least 3 times over the preceding decade, 70s. Wests are, as you said, 200-1 favourites before the season, but they're doing surprisingly well by round 7. And it's as if nothing happened between, what happened down in Junction Oval in Melbourne and Lidcombe Oval. No time has passed because it's back on again from the whistle. And another brutal game. And it's interesting because I think, Roy Masters has talked about the fact that, the us and them mentality, the Fibros and the Silvertails. But they also talked about it, and Tommy Rodonick has talked about it as a tactic. You go out early, you put on the biff, and for the rest of the match, the opposition are looking for payback, whereas you're playing football. And West's run out winners in that game, 13-7. But it's a game that's also known for something else that happens in that Les Boyd and John Donnelly are suspended, not by the referee, not cited by the referee on the day, but they're suspended in hindsight based on video evidence, which you probably be the expert on this, but I'm thinking that might be the first time that's happened in the Rugby League. So.
Yes, Paul, it was. It was actually the first time. I mean, as you said, West did win the game 13-7. Steve Knight, the player you mentioned there before from Manly Centre, he was sent off. Brian Curran in the Sydney Morning Herald reports that the 10,931 spectators witnessed some of the best uppercuts and right hooks since the old Barn boxing stadium closed down. And Bob Abbott, who was a member of the league's executive, says, quote there, "These incidents don't present the game in the image that it ought to be shown." So, well, the New South Wales Rugby League is already starting to express some concerns about what's been going on in the game. But you're correct. This was, well, it's sort of quite, well, it's probably unfortunate that the cameras, because Channel 7 did cover, Channel 7 had the rights to Rugby League at that stage. They covered the West Manly game, but on the same day that West played Manly, there was a match at Cogra Oval between St George and Parramatta, and this was the rematch, I suppose you could say, of the 1977 Grand Final. And in that match, 4 players were sent off. This Grand Final replay between St George and Parramatta. So the following day, the newspapers, of course, are full of headlines about terrible violence and how violent the game has become. So, yes, the New South Wales Rugby League decides that they're now going to use video evidence to cite players to appear before the judiciary. And, of course, these days, Paul, this happens, virtually every game. You have players getting cited. So, and as a result of this, Les Boyd and John Donnelly become the first players suspended on video evidence. And Roy uses this. He uses this decision by the New South Wales Rugby League to, sort of add to the us and them ideology. You know, he's look at how West are being treated compared to other teams. We're having players suspended, not on the field of play, but down there at the headquarters of the New South Wales Rugby League. So it was sort of a bit of a history-making match in that way. They play Manly again later that year.
Yeah.
Actually, before we get to that match, I should just mention as well, round 11. There was a round 11 clash there against Cronulla. So it's they're playing Cronulla at Lidcombe Oval, and Cronulla are having a very good year. All right, they've been on top of the table for most of the season. Norm Provan is coaching Cronulla at this point of time, but West defeat Cronulla. They beat them quite easily by 20 points to 2, and Western Suburbs go to the top of the competition table, and this is the first time since June the 22nd, 1963, that West have been on top of the table. So there was a bit of a history there for the Magpies. But just getting on to this second match against Manly at Brookvale, it's a very staid affair. Yeah. It was a match played the day after a test match against New Zealand. So both sides were missing some players. And there's virtually no violence in the match. Roy Masters says, quote, "We knew there would be a bloke sent off even if he growled at them." So Manly did win the game by 16-10. But the next very important match in 1978 takes place in the last round of the premiership. It's round 22. West are playing Cronulla at Endeavour Field. And it's an important game because this match will decide the minor premiership, okay? Cronulla, of course, have never won the minor premiership. And for West, it's, they've not been minor premiers since 1961. Any memories of this match at all, Paul?
It's pretty limited. Like the focus, it's funny this year, like the focus, and this was in the movie, but also in my memory, was very much West versus Manly, West versus Manly. And
all right, but no, okay. It was a match. It was a match that, Western Suburbs did win. It was a fairly scrappy game, another very scrappy game. It was a game where Les Boyd did stand out. But with 7 minutes to go, Peter Rolls of West 5'8", Peter Rolls kicks a field goal, and West win by 18-17. So it's the first minor premiership for West since 61, and it's also a personal sort of milestone for Peter Rolls because he scores 215 points in that season, and that's the highest number of points ever recorded by a West player in a premiership season. He passed the record set by Darcy Russell in 1959. So, Paul, do you have any memories of Peter Rolls?
Yeah, like a lovely fellow, and ex-rugby international. Played, got 2 caps playing for Australia, and he's the son, a little bit ironically, of Ron Rolls, who played for Manly, played rugby league for Manly. Peter switched from Union to Rugby League in the mid-70s, and I think he played 1 or 2 seasons with Manly in the reserves before coming to West in 77 and 78. And as you say, he won them that game, but you could also say that he won them the minor premiership. So his
kicking was very important.
Absolutely. Great. Yeah, an old style front on kick. So good to watch.
Now, as a reward for winning the minor premiership, the club president there, Bill Carson, announces after the match that all the players and the coach are going to receive $100 from the minor premiership prize money there, and also the club sponsor Victor also gives the players a $100 bonus, and it's very important as well. The Victor became the club sponsor during this 78 season. Because, West at this stage, they're basically a club that survives basically on gate receipts, and there's a small amount of money coming from the Leagues Club in Ashfield. So, okay, we come to the 1978 final series, Paul, and I think most people would agree that, let's say that a lot of strange things happened during this 1978 final series. Firstly, during the premiership, I think most people would have regarded Jack Danzy as the number 1 referee, but towards the end of the season there, Greg Hartley, who'd been dropped to reserves, during the season. Well, towards the end of the premiership rounds, Greg Hartley Well, he comes back into first grade, and well, he becomes the number one referee. So in the final series, West have the week off, and Roy Masters takes the team into a camp at Blacktown there. Now, in the first week of the finals, Cronulla win the qualifying final. They upset Manly by 17-12, and in the elimination final, Parramatta they eliminate Canterbury by 22-15. So we come to the major semi-final, and this is between West and Cronulla. Unfortunately, played in very heavy conditions. John Doherty threw a terrible pass just before half-time there, which is intercepted by Cronulla winger Steve Edmonds, and at half-time it's 10-4. West did get it back to 10-all late in that game, but overall it was a very disappointing performance. Cronulla win by 14-10, and in the minor semi-final, well, this is where a few extravagant things started to happen, because Manly and Parramatta play out a 13-all draw in the minor semi-final. Manly were way behind. They were behind by 13-3, but they stage a late, come back there, and it's a 13-all draw. Now, in those days, Paul, there was no extra time. The match was replayed on the Wednesday. And Manly, again, they stage an incredible comeback. They were down 11-2 with 19 minutes to go, but they scored 3 tries, and they win the match 17-11. So that means Manly qualified to play West in the preliminary final. Have you got any memories of this match, the preliminary final, 1978?
Manly versus West, the preliminary final. I've got lots of memories of that that final. And as you say, you know, there's an extra character comes in, the referee Greg Hartley, and there's some controversial decisions in the later half of the year. You know, the Parramatta Manly game sees the 7 tackle try, which is a little bit notorious. But by the time, I think it's September the 9th, the Western Manly prelim final, it's memorable, I suppose, and heartbreaking for West supporters. And this is how I sort of bookended the documentary, because we have 2 disallowed tries, one to Jeff Foster in playing, I think, his last season for West, and another one to Graham O'Grady, who, at least when I interviewed him 10 years ago, remembers every exact motion and move that he made, scoring what he thought was a try. So 2 disallowed tries, which if they'd been allowed, West would have won. And it was just a very anticlimactic end to the season. As I mentioned before, the focus for a West supporter in that season was West versus Manly. And you thought the fitting sort of end to that, the climax to that movie would be a West Manly grand final, but we had that the week early. Only one of us got to go through, and unfortunately, from my point of view, it was them. But they were a team of good players, and I think it's important not to dwell on the refereeing or anything like that. They had some fantastic players, Krilich and Eady and Stephen Knight, and they outplayed us on the day. It was unfortunate for everybody that, the decision, there were 2 disallowed tries to West, but there was also a disallowed try to Manly. So, what can I say? It was heartbreaking for me at the time. It's probably the main reason why I made a film about it 30 years later. So.
Yes, well, Manly did win by 14-7. Roy Masters, after the game, says that the team basically made too many handling errors, and people start. A lot of the journalists are writing about the SCG hoodoo, because Western Suburbs haven't won a game at the SCG for quite a long time. But and of course, Paul, Manly would go on to win the 1978 premiership after they against Cronulla. There was a 13-all draw, but the replay, Manly win quite easily. Now, in 1979, sorry, the 1970 side, before the season starts, West, Peter Rolls, who we highlighted before, top points he actually leaves West and goes to play for Newtown. And I think actually this was quite a big loss for West, because I noticed during the course of the 79 season, West have a lot of different 5/8s. There's a lot of different combinations there, and of course they miss his goal kicking. Mick Lubinskas, who you mentioned earlier, he goes off to Balmain.
That's right.
West got a few players. They got Mark Bevan and Warren Boland from Balmain, and Jack Jeffries, a hooker from St George, joins the club. And crucially, I think John Doherty resigns to play with West, basically on the eve of the season. Because most people, the thinking in the off-season was that John Doherty would leave Western Suburbs. Now, before the season starts, Eric Cox, who was the head of referees, he warns all the referees to stamp out illegal play, or, quote, if they don't, they will be dropped and we will find referees who will carry out our instructions. And in reply to this directive, Peter Peters there, who's a journalist at this stage with the Sun Herald, he says, and I quote again, violence in rugby league will never be completely eliminated, but the marked increase in high tackles at all levels of the game is causing great concern. So it's clear at this game at this stage that the game's officials are starting to worry about the violence in the game. So the season starts, 79 starts. Western Suburbs again start very well. They win their first 4 matches. But Manly, West play Manly twice in 1979, and both of these matches are very significant, I think, for different reasons. In the first match there, it's round 9 at Brookvale. Any memories of this game? It's a very niggling match.
Yeah, well, the big highlight, apart from the fact that West's come out on top, because as we all know, Manly had a bit of a hangover this season. There's another big blue. John Donnelly, Dallas, and Stephen Knight are both from Manly, and Dallas from Western Suburbs are sent off. So it appears the much announced crackdown didn't quite filter through to the dressing sheds at Lidcombe. But as I said, it's interesting about this crackdown on illegal play, and I think there is, from all accounts, you'd have to say that there was more violence on the field in the second half of the 70s. But the other thing is that you notice, and I noticed this from looking through footage, is that from the early 70s to the late 70s, TV coverage gets much more sophisticated. There's more angles, replay, slow motion. So a lot of the niggling and little dirty stuff that once stayed on the field is suddenly is much clearer on people's TV screens. And that generates its own commentary in the press and on TV, and it becomes a cycle. And I think the league, very much wanting to modernise and popularise the game, and it felt that they had to respond to that. Right going back to the game in the beginning of 1978, the league is all worried about that increasing focus on violence, and unfortunately, Wests, tended to be the whipping boy for that violence. So when anything happens, a West versus Manly game as this one at Brookvale on May 20th, 1979, no surprise that 2 players are sent off.
Yeah, well, Brian Curran there from the Sydney Morning Herald, he did make 2 very interesting observations there. Because West did win the game, as you pointed out, they won by 17 to 10. But he noted that he says here that despite the brawls and the niggling tactics, Western Suburbs played some very attractive football, and he highlights two great tries that West scored. One in the first half there was scored by Warren Boland. It was a 75-metre movement there. There were 7 players involved in the try. There was another try in the second half by Don Mosley, a 60-metre effort, and again, a lot of players handled the ball. And Paul, I suppose this is one of the misconceptions about this Western Suburbs team. It's a team that had an image of being, rough and tough and, well, even illegal. But and Paul, I saw a lot of, as I was researching this, there was a lot of old YouTube clips from this era, tries scored in this during this period, and Western Suburbs, Paul, Western Suburbs did play some really good rugby league during this period.
Absolutely, and it's a team. Rodonicus, Boyd, John Dorahy. I mean, there's some great players there, many of which went on to play for New South Wales and for Australia. So, and I think that's the only thing with all the Fibros stuff and the violent stuff, that the skill, the footballing craft and skill of many of the West players gets overlooked in this era. As you say, all the media hype is about how dirty they are or how rough or whatever, but when no amount of roughness gets you to the top of the ladder in 78 or to the position they came fourth in 1979. So great players, great footballers, and I love watching those old games. It's different to the style of play now.
Very different to the modern game.
But when they break out and when they're running, it's really exciting stuff to watch.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that Brian Curran noticed, and he wrote about this round 9 fixture, was that at half time of the match, there was an exhibition touch football game played by 20 boys aged 5 to 6. And, unfortunately, this exhibition match developed into a free-for-all with the boys exchanging blows. And quote here, the New South Wales Rugby League will undoubtedly be disturbed by the example being set to youngsters. Yeah. And after this match, there's another very important article there written by Gary Lester in the Sun Herald. He's interviewing Roy Masters. And in this article, Masters starts to blame the media for the brawls. And he promises that West are going to play a different brand of football, and he admits, he says, Roy Masters says that if it doesn't work, this new brand of football, he says, and I quote, "Give me 5 yards, a cloud of dust and a bucket of blood," and that would come back to be a very important quote later in the story of Western Suburbs. Now, the other match against Manly in 1979, it's round 20. This is a very important match for 2 reasons. Firstly, it's a crucial match in the race for the top 5 because West are on 22 points, Manly are on 21, Balmain are a 5th at this stage. It's a top 5, of course, back then. Balmain are in 5th position on 23 points. West win the match 21-13. Bit of a triumph because Tommy Rodonicus played most of this match with a broken hand. But the other reason this match is sort of important there is because Kerry Packer, the owner of the Channel 9 television network there, he attends this match. Now, at this stage, Packer is he's a benefactor of the Eastern Suburbs Club. Yeah. And it's reported that, he's basically at this match to have a look at the Western Suburbs hooker, Ray Brown. There's also rumours. There's rumours that other West players have received massive offers. At this stage, Paul, I should point out, at this stage in the history of the New South Wales Rugby League there, it was actually illegal to poach players during the course of the premiership season, you're not allowed to approach players during the competition to sign contracts for rival clubs. But of course, it does go on.
Yeah.
And there are rumours that both Les Boyd and John Doherty have been offered massive contracts of $48,000 a year to switch clubs.
Yeah.
So, Paul, we are starting to see here the vultures are starting to circle West. At the end of the 1979 season, as you said there, West finished fourth.
Yeah.
St George are on top of the table. St George finished top with 34 points. Parramatta second on 32. Cronulla 29 points. West are fourth on 28. And Canterbury basically fall into the top five. Canterbury, they lost their final match against Manly. Manly, the premiership favourites at the start of the season, failed to make the semi-finals. So Canterbury finished fifth. Basically, if Balmain had beaten South in the last round, and South hadn't had a great season, Balmain would have finished fifth. But South score a late try there, and they defeat Balmain 12 points to 11. So Canterbury finish in fifth spot. So, Paul, the elimination semi-final is against Canterbury, West versus Canterbury. Any recollections of this match? No one gives Canterbury a chance in this game.
No, considering how you outlined how they got into the finals, you really wouldn't. But it's always those games I find that come up and mug you. And it was, as you've intimated, the end of 79 going into 80 is a long season, off season of disappointment after disappointment. I think we'd shown, the biff had been toned down to some degree in 1979, and we were playing off our skills, and we made it into the finals, but then we unfortunately lost to that late interloper to Canterbury, and our season was over. But unfortunately, heading into 1980, the disappointments were not yet over.
Yes, well, Canterbury win the game. They win quite easily by 20 points to 6. Roy Masters is disappointed with too many handling mistakes and lost opportunities, because both Don Mosley and Buddy Kane there both had opportunity to score, but they didn't finish off the moves. And at the end of the match there, again, there's more speculation about Les Boyd leaving, John Doherty's going, and even Roy Masters going to leave Western Suburbs. Canterbury go on to make the grand final. But I thought, this is just another thing there, I thought it was very interesting to note, there was an article in the Sun Herald there where they asked the coaches of the 5 teams that had made the finals, they asked those coaches basically who they didn't want to play in the grand final. And Harry Bath, the St George coach, said, well, the team that he did not want to play in the grand final was Western Suburbs, but West didn't make it. Canterbury win the 1979, St George win the 1979 premiership. Now, the other very interesting thing happens in late in 1979, Paul. I just wanted to mention this to you because this as well comes up in your documentary. And this is at 60 Minutes, the Channel 9 program 60 Minutes. There is a segment by Ray Martin called The Gladiators.
Yeah.
And this segment highlights some of the West, well, I suppose you'd say, training methods. This becomes a major part of your documentary. Do you remember what this 60 Minutes segment told us about Western Suburbs Magpies, mate? Do you remember this?
Yeah, very much so. And I probably wouldn't have been allowed to watch it at the time, being a little young. But in hindsight, it's the controversial face slapping episode where, in order to warm them up in the dressing sheds just before they run out, Roy instructs the players to slap each other in the face. And the players that I interviewed had quite interesting memories of that. Peter Rolls remembers Roy saying that he instructed the players to warm up your partner's face, and everyone's stood around and gone, how? And it turned out that you had to slap them in the face. John Doherty remembers he didn't mind it. It was okay. Got you hyped up a bit for the game. He just didn't want to be partnered up with John Donnelly because he just took it a little too seriously. So, and that's a thing that gets hyped up by the media and blown all out of proportion. Not so much by 60 Minutes itself, because the 60 Minutes expose, if you like, it ends by saying we followed West for 6 weeks and we found nothing to substantiate rumours of drug taking and planned violence. Just 13 committed players who believed in their club. But that sort of tick gets sort of overshadowed by the visuals of the face slapping.
Yeah, well, because the day after this show, I mean, the newspapers there's full of headlines about, violence in the game, and people want immediate crackdown action to be taken. The New South Wales Rugby League, actually did indicate that they were going to question the relevant individuals. I mean, they never they never name who these relevant individuals are, but it's implied that there's people at West they're going to talk to, and I don't know. So, Paul, I don't know if you know. Do you know if Roy Masters was called into the New South Wales Rugby League? Was Roy ever asked to attend the headmaster's office, so to speak?
Well, I don't think so, because when you look at the footage, I mean, they're not doing anything wrong. Like it is a legitimate tactic to, teams warm up now. They warm up in AFL by sort of running, doing shoulder charges into each other and chest bumps and things like that. I mean, it's just a bit of that. I mean, that just sounds to me like a sort of media quote. And, when they sat down and thought, oh, have they done anything wrong? Oh, no, they haven't. So that's probably why I didn't call them in. So.
Yeah. All right, Paul, 1980. 1980 proves to be a critical year, not only for West, but also for the game of rugby league. Before the season starts, those vultures that we were talking about earlier, they have descended. Les Boyd, Ray Brown and John Doherty all signed to play for Manly. Graham O'Grady and critically Tom Raudonikis, they signed to play for Newtown, they've got a new benefactor, Newtown, the media owner, John Singleton. West pick up a few players. Peter Rolls comes back to the club. They get Ted Goodwin and John Rebo, and Warren Boland becomes the new captain. But there are also big changes at the New South Wales Rugby League, because in 1980, the New South Wales Rugby League appoints a former solicitor called Jim Comins to become the chairman of the New South Wales Rugby League judiciary. Jim Comins he actually did play rugby league. He played for the old Sydney University club in the 1930s. He was a lock forward. During the Second World War, he was a member of a Lancaster bombing crew. But his orders from the New South Wales Rugby League are quite clear. He's there to clean up the game of rugby league. So essentially, as I said earlier, Wyatt Earp rides into Tombstone, and he will have a dramatic impact on the way the game is played and officiated. Now, in 1980, Paul, I think there is one match that sums up the Western Suburbs club at this point of time, and that's the round 4 match against Manly at Lidcombe. Here we have a match where, West have no international players up against a Manly team that not only includes Les Boyd and Ray Brown and John Doherty, but also the likes of Graham Eadie, Alan Thompson, John Gray, the former English internationals there, and of course Captain Max Krilich. Do you remember this this match in 1980?
Well, it's memorable for the fact that despite all the defections, which is probably how I thought of it at the time. West's run out winners 19-4, And I think it just shows that there was a depth of talent down through, even down into the reserves and the under 23s at West that they're probably they weren't given enough credit for. Even without these star players, and as you say, the sort of biff has been toned down forcibly in this year. They still have the depth of talent and the craft and the footy skill to run out winners.
Yes.
So that and given what happened, I just remember being absolutely devastated when Boyd, Brown, and Doherty went to Manly. You grow up as a kid, I think, barracking for your team, and you're thinking, oh well, the players must barrack for the team as well.
Yes.
So when they leave, that's just devastating. And even more devastating when Tommy left to go to Newtown. As an adult, you understand why and they weren't paid very much back there. It was professional, semi-professional in some cases. So you can understand why they did it. But with that as the backdrop, that disappointment and sense of loss, to run out in round 4 and whip them at Fortress Lidcombe was still, it was extra sweet, that one.
Yes. Alan Clarkson, it was 19-4 they win. Alan Clarkson says, Western Suburbs produced one of the classic rags to rugby league riches sagas with a 3-match whitewash of Manly Warringah at Lidcombe Oval yesterday that put them on top of the premiership and the club championship table. He's talking there about 3 matches because Western Suburbs, well, they not only won the first grade, they also won the reserve grade and the under 23s. So they must have, yes, as you point out, had a lot of depth. In the return match later that year at Brookvale, the tables are turned a bit. Manly did win that game by 11-8. It's described as Manly's best performance of the season. Ray Brown, who's now at Manly, is sent off, and Bruce Gibbs gets sent off in the second half. West scored 2 tries to 1, but Manly win by 11-8. Now, the finals in 1980, the final competition table, I'll go through this quickly. Easter are minor premiers on 30 points. Canterbury also finish on 30 points. Western Suburbs finish on 28 points. It should be pointed out, actually, Paul, that West were actually beaten in the last round there. They lost against Newtown, Tommy Radonikas Newtown in the last round. But if West had beaten Newtown, they would have actually finished on top of the table. They would have been minor premiers again because their for and against was much better than both East and Canterbury.
Yeah, 21, yeah. Yes,
but St George finished 4th and South are 5th. So competition favourites Manly missed the semi-finals. It means, Paul, that West have to play Canterbury in the qualifying semi-final at the SCG. And again, unfortunately, it's another loss to Canterbury, who, again, most people, West go into this match favourites because they'd beaten Canterbury twice during the competition rounds. They beat them quite easily, 24-8 at Lidcombe, and even at Belmore, West beat them by 29-9. So, but this match, Canterbury are just way too good. A couple of late tries there to John McLeod and Bob Cooper, but Canterbury win by 22-17, and the other match there, St George defeated South in the elimination final. So now West have to play St George in the minor semi-final. It's a close and very tight affair. It's 2-2 at half-time, and St George do take the lead early in the second half there after their fullback Brian Johnson scores. But a very good move there by blindside move from a new player for West, Jim Lease, and Alan Neal. And John Rebo goes over, so West take the lead, and Ron Giddo kicks a couple of more penalties later in the game. So West win by 13 points to 7. So that SCG hoodoo that all the journalists were talking about is finally over. First, It's West's first win at the Sydney Cricket Ground in 8 years.
Wow.
And, of course, Harry Barth's concerns about West, well, they came back to bite him. Of course, a year earlier, he was worried about meeting West in the finals. Well, West have now eliminated the premiers. Canterbury defeat East in the major semi-final. So West will now play East in the preliminary final, September the 21st at the SCG. Do you remember, or do you want, I suppose I should ask, do you want to remember this game?
I would prefer that we skipped over this game pretty quickly, actually.
Yes.
41-5 flogging. And yet again, we get to the altar and
Yes.
wanting. This is a great season because, we lose all those players. We draw on sort of homegrown players from the lower ranks, lower grades. We pull everything out. We still come up third, and we just fall at that final hurdle.
Yes.
Of getting into the grand final. I suppose the last hurdle, but it wasn't a good win to lose to Kerry Packer's team by that margin.
Yes, Roy Masters says, I've never been so embarrassed in my life. It was the most humiliating defeat I have ever had as a coach. And it is, 41-5. It is the largest ever loss in preliminary final sort of history anyway. So in 1981, more players are leaving West. Ron Giddo goes to Eastern Suburbs. Peter Rolls retires. Bruce Gibbs retires. But as you said, they're developing players. Players like Gary Jack and Ross Conlon, Trevor Cogger. They also get a start in first grade in 1981. Warren Boland, unfortunately, he breaks his leg in the preseason there. So the little 5'8", Alan Neal, he becomes a captain. Have you got any memories of Alan Neal?
Well, he was that leader in that early part of the 80s. Renowned for his red hair.
Yeah.
It's an interesting season, but by this stage, coming from nothing, 77 into 78, we've come close so many times, and each season we have a bit of a shedding of talent.
Yes.
To lose Warren in preseason was bad, but the season starts pretty well, as I'm sure you'll get onto.
Yeah.
And we're back at March 29, I think, round one, we're at Lidcombe versus Manly. So you couldn't ask for a better staging to start the season. So
it's a controversial game because again, the controversy starts even before the game gets underway because the Referees Association there makes a complaint to the New South Wales Rugby League.
Yeah.
There is a picture of Greg Hartley in the referees' room, surrounded by maroon and white flowers in the referees' dressing room there. And the game itself is not a great one. Again, a lot of mistakes and a lot of niggling. John Donnelly's finger is almost bitten off by Les Boyd.
Well, that's allegedly.
Yes, allegedly.
And in retaliation, he hits him and gets sent off.
Yeah.
And gets the as far it may not be the longest, but at the time was a huge sentence. He's Dallas suspended for 14 weeks, which is a huge chunk of the season. So
Manly win the game. They win by 24-12.
Yeah.
And after the game, the veteran broadcaster there, Frank Hyde, notes, Rugby League has become a vehicle for the thug who, although in the minority, is bringing the game into disrepute. The two sides meet again later in that season, and Manly win again. They win by 30-12. And West are in the top five for most. For most of the 1981 season, West are in the top five. It's only late in the year that they drop out. Round 19, they're beaten by St George there, and they drop out of the top five. They win their final match of the season. They beat East in the final round. East, who were again minor premiers this year, but Manly had a 20-all draw with Parramatta in the final round. So Manly finished 5th and West in 6th spot. So right throughout this period, there are rumours that West Leagues Club in Ashfield there won't be able to keep many of the best players. It's a constant theme throughout this period. Yeah. I don't think the Leagues Club then was, as lucrative as it is today. So more players leave West. Gary Jack goes, John Rebo goes, Trevor Ryan, Ian Schubert all leave. And then we have the announcement that Roy Masters will also leave the club. Roy goes to coach St George, where Harry Bath has retired. And he made a very good point when he retired. He made some very good points about his time at West. He says here, I quote, the most effective spin-off from all our success has been the building of a Western Suburbs identity. Terry Fernley takes over as West coach in 1982, and he gets West to a 5th position, but then in 1983, West excluded from the competition by the New South Wales Rugby League. They fight on thanks to people like Rick Wade, but they finished with a wooden spoon in 1983, and then a whole new struggle begins for the Magpies. And as for Jim Comans, as you mentioned earlier, that cleanup, it started up with West's second row, Bob Cooper, actually. It was Bob Cooper receives a 15-month suspension. Yeah. A fellow from Cronulla called Steve Neen in 1982, he also got 12 months suspension. And then, of course, Les Boyd follows in 1983 with another 15-month suspension. So the spear tackle, the stiff arms, gouging, late high tackles, they would all be eradicated from the game. So, Paul, what are your memories of this period in Western Suburbs history?
In contrast to all that, I suppose my memories are, it sort of connects with what you quoted Roy as saying there. West Magpies always had a bit of a problem that, as Sydney has grown, what's the Western Suburbs has always moved out. So we, from when we began in where my family is from, sort of, Lewisham, Ashfield way, that was Western Suburbs, and then we got moved to Lidcombe, and then we got moved to Campbelltown, and as you say, mid-80s, we nearly got thrown out of the competition, and then the amalgamation came along. But I think from this period, what we got is, we weren't connected to a particular spot, like Parramatta is Parramatta, Penrith is Penrith. And what Roy gave us in this period was that sense of an identity. It was the Fibros identity. It was the fact that we were up against richer clubs from the north and the east of the city, and that those clubs had. It's hard not to argue that they had a lot of influence over the game itself and the whole competition. So there was that sense that we were up against those clubs and up against the sort of leadership of the rugby league. So building that identity is where there wasn't a solid one. There had been in the past, but there wasn't for most of the 70s. That was great. And I think without that identity being built up, we wouldn't have been able to sort of resist the attempts to throw us out of the competition in the mid-80s. Without that, we would have been gone. So, that's my memory of it. And that's, it was a great time. I was a kid, obviously, but I know a lot of people remember that time. And it's a good, you can make something out of nothing. You may not have money or connections, but if you've got talent and skill and a sense of yourself, a sense of identity, then you can do well. And I think that's that's a pretty solid Australian value as far as I'm concerned.
That's the way it was. Western Suburbs, 1978 to 1981. My name's Rob Corral on behalf of Paul Oliver. This program was recorded in the studios of Undercover Music. Your producer is Adriano Aldemar. Until next time, may the force be with you.